All right, this is discussion 13A. It's the only part of the discussion. I want to just ask you a really huge question, a really big one. Is love universal? We've looked at a whole lot of cultures and a whole lot of civilizations through a whole lot of time in this course. And one of the interesting things we sort of ask, I mean, there are some similarities in the way human beings have conducted themselves in terms of romantic love and reproduction and sex and things like that. But there are also enormous variations that we've encountered. And I want to talk about several just to give you some ideas of just how wildly different human behavior around sexuality can be. We talked about the ancient Greeks. And one of the sort of standard things in ancient Greek culture was this idea that certainly men would get married and have children with their wives to create heirs, etc. But in Greek culture, it was very common for men to carry on homosexual relationships with each other, and often to have a sort of a father. No, that's a bad example, but an older man having a sexual relationship with a younger man as a sort of a mentorship and a way of breaking that man up into the world. And so it was fairly common for a man in his 30s or 40s to begin a sexual relationship with a man in his late teens, and they would have that relationship for a while, and the man would sort of be a mentor and help him get started in life and maybe establish business or what have you. But then the younger man would get married somewhere in his 20s and would take a wife and produce a family, etc. But then when he got older, he might go and have a sexual relationship with a younger man. And in fact, in the gender handout, I had you read a small section of Plato's Symposium. Well, the Symposium was this big after-dinner conversation where lots of people were having a competition to define what is love. And one of the stories in there, I mean, a number of the stories in there, revolve around men loving other men, and arguing about whether or not that's a more pure form of love because it doesn't involve reproduction and family and all those other things. So that's one example from ancient Greece. Tale of Genji, which was a Japanese novel, is about the court in medieval Japan. And there you have stories of people having sort of sexual escapades where I mean, there's a famous scene where Genji, the main character, sort of breaks into the house of this, or the room of this young woman in the royal palace, and he doesn't know who she is. But they talk for a while, and then they have sex, and then he spends days afterwards trying to figure out who he had sex with. It's sort of a completely different take on sexuality. Let me give you an example from medieval Europe. That in medieval Europe they had this idea called courtly love, and the idea was that a man would find a woman who he decided was the object of his affection, and he would spend months or even years trying to get her attention and get her to give him little things. And the whole idea was just that he would get her favor. He wasn't actually going to sleep with her. He wasn't actually going to have sex with her. He was just going to try to get her to give him like a favor and say, oh yeah, you can wear my glove on your helmet when you're in a tournament, and you can be my champion. And so it was sort of this idealized form of a relationship, and the man was supposed to put the woman up on this absolute pedestal of perfection and see her as the epitome of female perfection, but he never actually wanted to have a relationship with her. He just wanted to sort of worship her from afar. There's a famous example, a guy named Ulrich of Liechtenstein, who he was a medieval knight, and he decided he had decided on this one woman as the object of his affections, and she was married, but that didn't matter. And so he was going to do, I forget, 100 tournaments where he was going to go jousting in 100 tournaments and do 100 victories for her as a way of showing her his devotion to her. And so he started traveling around and doing all these tournaments and jousting, and he became so renowned for this that nobody would joust him anymore. So then he had to like dress up in disguises, even dressing up as a woman, to sneak into cities so that he could fight in tournaments and nobody would know who he was and he would win. And so he's trying to get this woman to notice him and to give him some sign of her affection. And, periodically Ulrich would stop off and see his wife and tell her how the whole thing was going. So this was a really strange thing from our point of view, that it really had nothing to do with sort of marriage and children. It had to do with, it was another form of love. And lots of cultures have had arranged marriages where the family sort of decides on a spouse for their child and negotiates the marriage, and then the children are basically told, here is the person you're marrying. And the assumption is that over time, it might just be an entirely cold relationship. They're supposed to produce children, and so they have to have sex, but that's it, and they're not expected to have any other sort of personal relationship. Or it might be, in sort of best case scenarios, that affection will develop over time, that they, by living together for so long, they'll eventually develop love for each other, etc. But that's a totally different idea than our modern ideas of sort of courtship and love, that you're supposed to find your soulmate and that person, and you know, you keep dating and trying different things until you find that soulmate, and then you marry that person, and that person's supposed to be sort of a perfect fit for you for the rest of your life. So overall, you're seeing, I mean, human beings have all these different variations, all these different ways that they've approached love and sex and marriage. And the question is there anything universal in there, right? And to give you some question, I mean, to give you some way to think about this, how much of the way we think about affection and love is shaped by the culture we grow up in? And how much is sort of a universal human need, that all people need this kind of affection or this kind of love, and so different cultures are just satisfying it in different ways? What is that relationship? And it's an interesting question in the sense that it's not absolutely clear what human beings need as far as affection, if you look across history, and what human beings need for reproduction. Now, there are some universal necessities here. I mean, human beings have to reproduce, right? We all have, well, most people have sexual urges. They've got, you know, the desire to have sex, and the human race needs to reproduce to continue to exist. And so there is this universal necessity for that. And so there's sex and reproduction on one level. But there's also these universal human necessities probably for some sort of affection. Human beings are social animals. We need to have some sort of affection. People who are in isolation go crazy, basically, if they don't have other people to talk to. Human beings need some sort of affection. But it's not entirely clear that sex and reproduction have to connect with affection and what have you. And I mean, you can see that with the example I gave from ancient Greece, that men were supposed to get married and have children with women, with their wives, but they were supposed to be finding affection and a romantic relationship with other men. And you see a similar thing, this is outside of the scope of this class, but in the French court, and amongst the French aristocracy in the 1700s, it was common. People were supposed to, they were in arranged marriages where they're supposed to have sex with their wife, but everybody had a romantic partner who was somebody else, right? In fact, there was a famous case of a French aristocrat who was actually ridiculed by other aristocrats because he was stupid enough to be madly in love with his own wife. That's crazy. Nobody does that, right? So it's a question of how different cultures have, do they connect reproduction and sex with affection and long-term relationships, or do they separate those things? You can go in different directions on that. But on an even more profound level, and I should just mention, every society has a sort of a need, a necessity, to regulate reproduction. By that I don't mean necessarily to limit the number of children people have or what have you, but rather societies have a vested interest in making sure that most of the children born have somebody who's going to care for them and has the resources to provide for that child, so the child can grow up successfully and be a productive member of society. They don't want every child to be an orphan. They don't want a whole bunch of children raised in really disruptive situations, which would lead to them being not good citizens when they're adults. So societies have a vested interest in making sure that there's a certain amount of stability around sex and reproduction. And that's generally what marriage is for. It's to make sure that you have two people who, when they produce a child, are locked into a relationship with each other so that they will both be there for the child. And the idea is that this will create more stability and more likelihood the child will grow up well. Well, marriage is one way you can handle that, but lots of cultures have handled that in different ways. You can see cultures where there's a much looser relationship between reproduction and marriage, where people essentially don't have an institution like marriage that's just one man and one woman. You have families raising children, etc. So there are other ways you can do that. But there is a necessity for regulating and managing reproduction to make sure that you're not bringing way too many children into the world and not caring for them, or way too few children. Right? So societies have generally tried to find ways to regulate reproduction, and often you also have things like customs around when you get married or what have you that will, if you encourage everybody to get married at age 16, you're going to have a lot more children than if you encourage everyone to get married at age 24. Because essentially that's 8 years that they're probably not having sex if they get married at age 24, but that's 8 years they are having sex if they get married at 16. So there are lots of ways that societies can regulate reproduction, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're regulating love. Right? And so you have to ask yourself, and I just realized I misspelled universal there, are the emotions that presumably all people feel, how much are those emotions shaped by the culture we're in? Are human emotions just always the same, and they're universal across all cultures, and that's just the culture has to adapt to that? Or do people have pretty vague emotional needs that get shaped by their culture, so that somebody growing up in one culture has fundamentally different, their emotional needs are manifested in fundamentally different ways than somebody growing up in a second culture? How much is love universal? How much is it shaped by the culture we grow up in? And how much is it a universal thing that's the same for everybody everywhere? These are questions that history naturally suggests, but it can't really answer. And so it's an interesting thing to think about.